if China it gets into a full-scale war with America and starts to look as if it's losing, that really threatens the power of the Communist Party in China, and as the Communist Party and President Xi would say, that is the integrity of China at risk. And there you get into a Putin type situation where he's saying he would use nuclear weapons to defend the integrity of the Russian state. Now, China hasn't changed its posture in that way, but the fear is that that might be the end result of this modernization. I'm Richard Spencer. I'm an international correspondent for The Times, and I specialize in the Middle East and China. So this week, the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute, which is one of the most respected think tanks looking in granular detail at the scale of military preparedness of the great powers and counting nuclear arsenals around the world, has produced its annual report on everyone's nuclear stockpiles. It basically is the facts and figures on how close to nuclear Armageddon we are, if you want to look at it in the most dramatic form. And they're very pessimistic this year. They say that all the major powers are either increasing their nuclear arsenals or at least modernizing their delivery systems. There's a general greater alertness to the possibility of nuclear conflict caused by a whole range of issues, not least the war in Ukraine, but also developments in the Far East. And one of its most striking findings was that the country that's increasing its nuclear arsenal fastest is China. China is a nuclear power. It's all the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, including China, are nuclear powers. That's partly why they're there and have this veto, because they are the sort of the pillars of the world security order, if you like. But China has always had a nuclear posture, as it's called in the trade, that is fairly minimalist and defensive. It's one of the powers that have said it would never be the first to use nuclear weapons. It would only ever use them in retaliation. Its historic doctrine is that nuclear weapons are paper tigers, that they're only used really for deterrence, and therefore it doesn't really matter how many of them you have, as long as you have enough to deter. And so it's always had a small arsenal compared to, say, Russia and America. In fact, just a few years ago, it only had about 200, 300 warheads compared to 5,000 each for Russia and America. Even Britain has more than that, has 240 or so nuclear warheads. But now it is adding to that arsenal at a fairly hefty rate. 90 new warheads last year. It's now up to 500 nuclear warheads. Very significant gains. It's also developing its intercontinental ballistic missiles, those massive long-range missiles that can deliver nuclear Armageddon. The missiles that you can fire from an American submarine and strike Moscow, and obviously vice versa for the Russians. And finally, it's also what it's not done before, which is actually keeping those warheads on missiles. So most of the world's nuclear warheads are kept in bunkers. They're kept under lock and key. They're only for use in the future. Russia and America both have them actually deployed, for example, on submarines around the world in case of suddenly needing to use them as they see it. But China's not done that. It's always kept its nuclear warheads in bunkers, but it is now believed to have started actually sticking them on warheads, on missiles, just in case it needs to use them. That's what they, again, in the trade, they call a high level of alertness. So, China is not the world's leading nuclear power by any means, but it is definitely modernizing its nuclear arsenal. It's definitely making it more prepared and definitely increasing it. Part of President Xi's overall policy of the last 10 years, which has been to upgrade its military and, increase what it calls its deterrence on all fronts against a very powerful America. So, as I say, this report talks about the level of alertness for these nuclear arsenals. There are 9 countries that are known to have nuclear weapons. 8 are declared. That's those 5 powers: America, China, Russia, Britain, and France. Added to that, in the last 25 years, you've had India and Pakistan that went nuclear in 1998, and then North Korea in 2006. And then on top of that, you have Israel, which has never admitted it's got a nuclear arsenal, but everyone knows it has, and it doesn't really deny it. It's fairly public knowledge that it has about 90 nuclear warheads. So that's the question. Very different sizes of those arsenals, very different sophistication of the missile systems that they would attach them to. Obviously, India and Pakistan, mainly their nuclear arsenals are targeted at each other. They're long-standing rivals. America, the kind of the world's policeman, has it in case of anything. Soviet Union has it because anything had them because if America had them, it had to have them, and Russia has inherited that. So the question is, how ready are any of these countries to use them? And there are two ways of looking at that. One is political, and there are a whole different ranges of what I would say with nuclear posture, if you like to use that technical term. Their stated policies under the circumstances in which they'd use those nuclear weapons. And then there's the physical readiness, which is what we're talking about here, the higher level of alertness. And a high level of alertness really means that, you've got warheads on missiles that are being carted around, as I say, most prominently, like the British ones, on nuclear submarines, nuclear armed submarines, ready to be fired if the host country comes under attack. And as I say, that is now the case in China. We don't know exactly where they're deployed, but it is again noticeable that China is developing nuclear-powered submarines. It has nuclear-powered submarines, and the assumption is that those submarines will at some stage be armed with nuclear weapons if they're not already. It's worth casting our minds back to the period 50 to 70 years ago, the end of the Second World War, particularly the 1960s up until the 1980s. Those years were really the peak years for nuclear fear of nuclear Armageddon. There was this idea that both of the major superpowers at the time, America and the Soviet Union, had enough missiles armed with nuclear warheads to destroy the world several times over. And the fear was that there'd be a war, it would escalate to a nuclear war, and then what we saw in Nagasaki and Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War would happen to cities all over the planet, that you'll be sitting in Leeds or Bristol or San Francisco or Moscow or Smolensk or wherever, and the other side's nuclear missiles would land on your head and obliterate your cities and destroy life as we know it. That has changed now. We now have tactical nuclear warheads, so smaller warheads that could actually be used on the battlefield to establish, dominance on a particular battlefield. People talk about a limited nuclear war where there would just be a limited exchange of nuclear missiles. But still, let's face it. The big fear is that the world could be destroyed by nuclear missiles, and what we mean by those nuclear missiles are these giant intercontinental ballistic missiles. There are obviously a missile is just another name for a rocket, and they all basically start with the rockets you fire on fireworks day or at New Year, and then they scale up, and so you have short range missiles which are used on a battlefield or on targets a few miles away. Then you have these medium range missiles, which is what you're seeing being fired in the Middle East at the moment, where missiles are fired anything from a few tens of miles from Gaza into Israel, or vice versa, or a few hundreds of miles, or even a couple of thousands of miles. Iran has missiles that could just about reach Israel. And then you have what the superpowers have, what the big powers have, is intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can go from one continent to another and carry a substantial warhead thousands and thousands of miles. So those are the missiles which the superpowers have, which they could use to target each other's capital cities. And those are really the sort of, you want to say those are the nuclear option, to use the cliche. Those are literally the nuclear option where superpowers essentially do mutually assured destruction, that old phrase of nuclear posture, where you're saying, if you attack my civilization, I will destroy your civilization. And that's what we're talking about, and that's what China looks to be getting back into, if you like. So China is very insistent that it has a defensive nuclear posture. It's, as I say, it's right from the beginning, from its first missile test in 1964, which was authorized by Chairman Mao. He put out a statement, or China put out a statement. He was leader at the time, saying posture is defensive. We sign up to and urge other countries to sign up to a no first use policy. We will not use nuclear weapons unless we are attacked with nuclear weapons. So compare that with, say, Russia, which is under President Putin has openly threatened to use nuclear weapons if it feels that Russia is under threat in the Ukraine war. It is under a sort of existential threat. America has a very broad and undefined nuclear posture, it has to be said. So, our side is not innocent. China says its nuclear weapons are purely defensive. And it's fairly actually clear to see at the moment in China what their military posture is all about. And in this case, you can say, well, it is defensive in some sense. What they are trying to establish, what President Xi is trying to establish, is a position where it is the dominant power in East Asia and in the certainly in the West Pacific, its side of the Pacific Ocean. It wants to be able to be in a position where, if, say, the most obvious example, if it wanted to attack and invade Taiwan, it could do so, and if America intervened, China could fight off America in that, what it regards as its very specific sphere of influence. So it says it has localized ambitions, not global ambitions. It says America is the one with global ambitions. China has local ambitions. So, and obviously it wouldn't want to use nuclear weapons against Taiwan. That would make no sense. So what it's saying is, this is our posture. We are developing a naval power in the Pacific. We want to be the dominant power in the West Pacific. We want control of what we regard as our sphere of influence in our coastal waters, including Taiwan, which it regards as part of China. And we will use legitimate means to defend our interests in those in the event of conflict there. Now, it doesn't need to use nuclear weapons for that, obviously. What it's saying is that if you then use nuclear weapons against China or very heavily attack us, then we have this nuclear option. Now, the last bit is that last bit of the or is quite important, really, because, as I say, it says it would not use nuclear weapons first. In which case, why modernize your nuclear arsenal in this way? You've got the deterrent effect. Except that, having nuclear weapons at sea is very important, and that's one of the things that China is looking at. But in general terms, is it thinking about changing that posture? Is it saying, okay, what happens if there is all-out war over Taiwan and China looks as if it's losing, and if China gets into a full-scale war with America and starts to look as if it's losing, that really threatens the power of the Communist Party in China, and as the Communist Party and President Xi would say, that is the integrity of China at risk. And there you get into a Putin-type situation where he's saying he would use nuclear weapons to defend the integrity of the Russian state. Now, China hasn't changed its posture in that way, but the fear is that that might be the end result of this modernization. But there's no sign at the moment that China is doing that. That's just one of the concerns that you might have if you looked at these developments. Well, as I say, America is constrained in how much it can criticize other countries for their nuclear posture, because it has a very unclear nuclear posture, and of course it has one of the two largest nuclear arsenals. Now, the Russian nuclear arsenal is a little bit bigger than the American one, but only by a fraction, and the American delivery systems are certainly better. And so the country that has the most nuclear power, the country that spends more on its nuclear arsenal every year than the rest of the world put together, the American arsenal is much more expensive to update and modernize and keep properly protected and prepared. Is America. So it's limited in its criticism. And certainly at the moment, although there is concern about China on a whole range of fronts, I think most American strategists regard other issues as of more pressing importance. Ukraine, the instability of Russia, the instability of the Middle East will, even in terms of nuclear weapons, North Korea, which now has 50 nuclear warheads, according to the same report, that's a big increase as well, and is an inherently unstable state, an inherently threatening state that regularly threatens to wipe South Korea off the map, a key American ally. It's worried about that. It's worried about whether Iran will go nuclear. Iran has this nuclear program that's very controversial, which would, and if they actually, which they could do quite easily now, is develop and test nuclear warheads, that would totally change the stability and the security architecture of the Middle East. You'll then have pressure from Saudi Arabia to also develop nuclear weapons, other countries in that region. That would obviously be very worrying for everyone. Those are the main concerns. I think America accepts that China wants to modernize its military more generally. The direct threat to American interests is coming from the expansion of numbers in the Chinese Navy, which is now enormous, and that really is growing incredibly fast, and with on-the-ground effects in terms of the direct daily experience of American allies in the region, like the Philippines, like Taiwan, like South Korea, in terms of Chinese naval presence near their waters. Those are its main concerns. The nuclear development is interesting as a sign of President Xi's sort of broader ambitions. The thing about President Xi and the Chinese military is, again, the headline figures are quite scary, particularly if you look at the power of China and the fact that it is a threat to Western allies in the area and democracies in the area, and China is establishing itself, as the Soviet Union did after the Second World War, as a alternative system of governance to the systems of government that we use, the democratic systems that we use. China's saying, maybe you'll be better off under our system. And at the moment, I mean, we don't know how long this will go on for. At the moment, China's got a good case to make. It's become a lot richer recently. It's developed very fast, and it's developed its strategic and regional power very fast. It kept its nationalist population very happy on those fronts. So there are things to worry about. On the other hand, you have to look where they're coming from. And, if you look in the context of, what's been happening in the last 25 years around the world, or since the fall of the Soviet Union, since the end of the Cold War, for 10 years, everyone was very optimistic. Everything was going to be great. There's going to be no cold wars, no more superpower confrontations. China was at the time, quite close to America. China's economy was developing. It was liberalizing. It was becoming a much more normal state than it had been under Chairman Mao. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, became an economic power as well, started joining Western type organizations like the G20. It would come to summits on sorting out, complicated issues to do with money. No one thought there was going to be a world war ever again. Everyone was quite comfortable. Then in 2003, America invaded Iraq. And, although that's now seen as a bit of a disaster from an American point of view, from a China point of view, it was incredibly frightening that in the name of promoting democracy, America could just walk into a country on the other side of the planet and remove its leadership in 3 weeks, which is what America did in 2003 with British support. And, the Chinese leadership was saying, what if they do that to us? What if something goes badly wrong and we're suddenly faced with this? What does our military look like? And at that time, their military looked very, very old-fashioned. It had millions of men. It was the biggest army in the world because China was then by far and away the most populous country in the world. But it didn't have very good kit. It didn't have very good missiles. It didn't have very good warships or fighter jets. Nothing to compare with America. It was very backwards in its whole military thinking. And they thought, we've got to do something about this. So ever since then, there's been this massive drive to modernize the military. And what President Xi, when he came to power 10 years later in 2012, 2013, discovered was that this was being foiled by huge amounts of corruption in the military. The military was like an empire of itself. It wasn't really answerable to anyone. The army does not come under the organs of the state in China. It comes under the Communist Party. But the Communist Party is quite an amorphous organization at that level, because the leading people in the Communist Party are the leading people in the state, and they're busy with their day jobs of running the economy and so on. So the military just got on with itself and just bled money into the pockets of generals. So she has also had this massive anti-corruption campaign. And he says, we've got to have a modern military. And he says, the only way to have a modern military is to look at America, look at what it does, and do the same. So if America has aircraft carriers, fleets of aircraft carriers going around the Pacifics, we have to do the same. If America has nuclear armed submarines floating around the Pacific, we have to do the same. So it is in some cases literally stealing the technology to do this, but it's only developing technology to compete with America sort of face to face in all spheres. But of course, the main sphere that America and China is likely or could come into conflict in the next 10 years is in the Pacific over these islands like Taiwan and other Western allies that perceive themselves as being a threat from China. So the Navy has had a huge weight of emphasis, and that means aircraft carriers. China now has 3 aircraft carriers. It didn't have any 10 years ago. It now has a massive fleet of other warships and submarines, both diesel submarines and nuclear submarines. And as I say, the obvious next step for a nuclear-powered submarine is to stick a nuclear-powered warhead on that submarine. And then, just to make these things absolutely clear, the advantage of nuclear-powered submarines is that it can roam around the world with its nuclear missiles on board. And if your enemy hits your army bases, your cities, your missile bases on land, it's much harder to hit a submarine that you don't quite know where it is, because it's a mile under the water somewhere near the Arctic ice caps. So that is really what China is doing in a nutshell, and at the moment it's doing it pretty successfully.